Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with our preview of Leonard Slatkin's 10 best recordings. But there are 20 of his 10 best recordings. Why? Because I invited Maestro Slatkin to contribute his own list of his 10 best recordings, and he agreed to do it. In fact, he did it like instantaneously. I was dazzled. I was so impressed. He's such a nice guy. No, what happened was, coincidentally, he's working on his fourth book, which ought to be out in about a year and a half. It's called Words Without Songs, Further Reflections on a Life in Music. Now, his first three books were very good. I've read them all, and quite interesting for the insights they offer into the job of conductor and our musical culture and all of those things. And so for this book, he was thinking, I really need to talk about my recordings and which my favorite ones are and what my not so favorite ones are, which I'm not going to mention. That's up to him. But the fact of the matter is, he had the list. It was all ready. So he sent it over to me, and I have it. And so in addition to my view of his 10 best recordings, we'll see his, and you can see which ones overlap. There are some overlaps, I will tell you, but not that many, which makes it even more interesting. But of course, he's been so prolific a recording artist in the first place, and so it's not really that surprising. But if you want to see those fabulous lists, you will have to be a ClassicsToday.com Insider subscriber. So please subscribe at the link below this very video, which I will put in the description of the video, or you could just go to the ClassicsToday.com homepage and do it that way. These best conductor videos, we're going to start doing other artists as well, not just conductors, by the way. But they've been going very, very well. And this is, I think, number 17. I'm looking. I have a list here. Let me see if I can do this. Who have we done so far? It's really kind of fascinating going back. We've done Bernard Haitink, and Arturo Toscanini, and Otto Klemperer, and Leopold Stokowski, and Simon Rattle, and Pierre Boulez, and Herbert von Karajan, Adrian Bolt, Carlo Maria Giulini, you remember him, Georg Schulte, Leonard Bernstein, Lauren Mazel. Oh my goodness, who's this one? It was recent, actually. I've got to take... Ernest Ansermet, of course. He did a bunch of orchestras there. Giuseppe Sinopoli, Thomas Beecham, and last week we did Nimi Yarvi. So that's a lot. That's quite a few recordings if you want 10 from each of them and you want to get them all. So I think we're covering the territory fairly comprehensively, and it's been so much fun to do it. So do please consider joining up and becoming a Classics Today Insider. Now, I really want to talk a bit about Leonard Slatkin, who was a fascinating musical personality. He came from an amazingly musical family. His father was the violinist and conductor Felix Slatkin. His mother was the cellist Eleanor Aller. Both were founding members and players in the Hollywood String Quartet. They were both Hollywood studio musicians. And so music was in Maestro Slatkin's blood. There's no question about it. And he's had an amazing career. He's made hundreds of recordings, and the standard of those recordings is very, very high. I have gone through my career as a music critic, having people, poo-poo Leonard Slatkin for the same reason they poo-poo Nimi Yarvi, because he has not made his career by focusing on the standard German repertoire. Mind you, he's performed it, and he performs it quite well. Detroit released download versions of his Brahms Symphony Cycle, a complete Beethoven cycle. He does all that music, and he does it very effectively. But the interesting thing is that hasn't been what he's been doing on records, and his recordings have been extraordinarily fine of some extraordinarily unusual music, and a lot of American music, and a lot of contemporary music, and a lot of interesting English music as well. And, his range is extremely wide, wider than his recording show, by the way, I will emphasize. But, I've already talked about the American collection, this extremely fine box of all of his, or some, I mean, they left out the most important one, arguably the Barber stuff. But anyway, 13 CDs worth of American music. There's just a wonderful, wonderful discography, all performed at a very, very high level. And I really don't think he gets the credit he deserves for the work he did for all those years in St. Louis. Going back and listening to those records, that orchestra is as good as any orchestra that ever existed. They are just splendid. The playing on some of those recordings is stupendous. And he deserves credit for maintaining that standard over all those years and making all those wonderful records with them. Granted, when the record industry was going insane and was just throwing money at people to make records. But think about it for a minute. Excuse me. They threw some of that money at a second tier American orchestra to do a lot of not standard repertoire. And that was a marvelous thing. And he was there to do it. And he was there to do it superbly well. Extraordinarily well. And I just think he's terribly underrated. I really do. And it's wonderful to be able to do something with a conductor who, A, is still alive. I mean, that's such a rarity in classical music. And B, is alive and still performing. I mean, we don't know if this will be the end of his discography. There may be more to come. Who knows what could pop out? And third, and this is the point I really want to talk about in this preview discussion, who listens to his own work. That requires, I think, a certain amount of courage, a certain amount of humility, and a certain graciousness as regards the listening public. Because nothing, and I mean nothing, disgusts me more than artists, and I've said this before, than artists who say, oh, I never listen to my recordings. I never want to hear my recordings. Sometimes they do it out of this sort of like faux perpetual dissatisfaction with themselves. To which my response is, if you're that dissatisfied, then stop. Just retire. Go do something else with your life. Don't bother us with it. And sometimes they just do it because they think that, they're so marvelous that their latest conception is the only valid thing. And what they did yesterday is no longer valid, in which case you should never have made a record. You should never have preserved your invalid prior vision of the work. I mean, it's ridiculous. I understand everything is subject to, circumstance and evolution and growth and all that. But artistic growth is something that either happens or it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because the artist all of a sudden decides that they've grown. I mean, that's just narcissism. That's all that is. And I really think that for an artist to say that they never listen to their recordings and to actually express a certain amount of disdain for them is to be absolutely contemptuous of their listenership, of the listening public, of the people who've invested their time and money into learning what that artist had to say about a particular piece of music. So when Maestro Slatkin said, he's writing this fourth book and he felt he had to go back and listen to all 7,000 recordings that he made, I was just transported. I think that's marvelous. I think it's marvelous. And, of course, you're not going to love all of them equally. And of course, you're going to hear all the mistakes and all the things you did wrong. It's that with anybody who creates anything. I mean, even lowly, pathetic, pitiful little me. When I go back and read my first master's thesis from Johns Hopkins University on Der Fall Hindemith, the Hindemith case, there are things I write. There's the way that I write that it just makes me cringe. But that thesis won the history prize. I was the outstanding graduating senior, graduating person in the history department at Johns Hopkins University that year, in 1983, I think it was. And so there must have been something there. And so you have to look also at the good stuff. You have to look at what you did that was well. And I think the important thing to really just emphasize is that if you gave 100%, if you had sincerity and you were really behind your work, even if it may have been misconceived, even if it didn't always go well, even if you've changed your opinion about it, you should be proud. You have nothing to be ashamed of. And you should be courteous and encouraging to the people who have put their money where their ears are and supported you all these years. And it is a wonderful sign of intellectual and emotional health coming from Maestro Slatkin, that he does that he listens. He actually listens. And one of the things he listened to, I'm going to talk about, and it's on his list, and it's not on my list. I'm going to give you this tantalizing little tidbit because I just think it's fascinating. One of the pieces that he selected as one of his top 10 recordings was this one, Schubert's Ninth, the Great C Major Symphony, or the Eighth, and I forget the number. I don't know, it's whatever number it is, but we call it the Ninth, the Great C Major Symphony, Deutsch 944. Now, I was shocked. I have to say I was shocked. And even Maestro Slatkin said, people don't usually regard me as, a big macher in this particular repertoire. But he really liked this performance. And in order to find out exactly why he liked the performance, you'll have to look at his book when it comes out. But I will tell you one thing. I hadn't heard it in 100 million years. It made no impression on me when I first heard it because there were just so many and I probably wasn't paying attention. But he focused my attention. So I pulled it out and I put it on. And I just want to tell you, this is one hell of a Schubert Ninth. I mean, this is a piece that all of those hoity-toity German specialists, repertoire specialists have done, the Furtwänglers and the Sells and, all those people, they did it. And they've done it multiple times. And, Klemperer and, all those cranky old German people, and Toscanini did it. And, everyone does it. It's one of the pinnacles of the German orchestral tradition and a very difficult work to pull off. My God, I did a talk on this symphony, of course, which you can look up. Of course, this performance isn't there in my list, and perhaps it should have been. I have to tell you, it's that good. And I'm not saying this because it's on Maestro Slatkin's list. If I didn't think it belonged there, I would say so. I don't have any problem with that. But what makes it so wonderful, I'm going to tell you what's so wonderful about it. It's immediately distinguishable from every other performance of the work, number one. Now, sometimes that's good, and sometimes if it's like, a debacle, that's bad. But in this case, it's good. It's very good. What does he bring to the picture that we don't hear in other performances? Well, I think the timings say a lot in this case. And in this particular case, he takes all of the repeats in the first three movements, but not in the finale. Now, I know some people will say, oh, God, he should have done the one in the finale if he does all the other ones. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure, because if you listen to the performance as a whole, that finale is just incredible. It just flies. And if you took the repeat and went back to the beginning again, when you've got all this momentum going along, I'm not sure that's a repeat that's worth taking. I'm really not. It works so well in the context of this performance that I think that was the right decision. And now, of course, someone will come back and tell me probably that he actually did take the finale, but that they edited it out when they put the performance together, and it was a mistake. I don't know. But after I make a whole thing about it, but I just think it works fabulously. For whatever reason, I hope it was a conscious decision on Maestro Slatkin's part. I think it just sounds marvelous that way. Second of all, the second movement is 14 minutes and 2 seconds long. It's exactly the same length as the scherzo with all the repeats. And that, to me, is just a splendid internal balance, not because I look at the timings and see it, but because you feel it that way. 14 minutes and a bit for the second movement is on the quick side. And it's a march, remember, it is a march. And many performances are considerably slower, 16, 17 minutes, who knows, 18 minutes, crazy. And it can really drag. It really can, because it goes round and around and around and repeats itself 100 times. This is so nicely paced. It just sounds so inevitably right. And the solo oboe plays fantastically. And then I'm going backwards now. I mean, the first movement with the exposition repeat, I like the way he handles the tempo transitions particularly. A lot of people after the introduction do a big accelerando into the first subject. Slatkin doesn't. A lot of people also don't. I mean, you can do it one way or the other. He keeps the tempo of the introduction steady and then makes the abrupt jump into the allegro, which is proportionally related to what had come before, I think. You don't get a sense of it being like something coming from Mars. It makes sense, but the extra jolt of energy that gives is really very, very exciting, and he does it without making the new tempo, the allegro tempo, crazy. And there's a nice, relaxing sort of lyrical slowdown for the second subject. And when he does the repeat and goes back, it's very perceptible that he's going back to the original allegro with the faster tempo. And so it makes the whole movement very, very interesting by articulating its sections, I think, in a very, very clear way, an unusually clear way. But I have saved some of the best for last, and that is the scherzo. Now, this scherzo is really long. You know it. I know it. Everybody knows it. Some performances, it's like the longest movement in the symphony. I mean, or almost the longest movement. It's just unbelievably long if you take all the repeats. And Slatkin takes all the repeats. But in the outer sections, he goes at a good enough clip. It's a good bracing tempo. So the repeats don't make you nuts. But what really blew my mind in this performance was the trio. That trio section is one huge, enormous binary melody. You know, it's in two halves, both repeated, but it's essentially one tune. And you know how it goes. And it just goes on and on and on, especially the second half. You don't think it's ever going to end. Some people talk about heavenly length. Well, it's length. Whether it's heavenly or not depends on the performance. And this is celestial. This is the best performance of the trio I swear I've ever heard, for a couple of reasons. Not just the tempo, but the balance and layering of the textures in the orchestra. You know, Schubert never heard any of this music. And so it's really a very, very difficult piece to bring off in terms of balance, especially because he tends to use the trombones as accompanying instruments with like thick harmony in sort of odd places. And this is one of those places. You know, you hear that there's just this sort of dum ba bum ba bum ba da, you know, this sort of dense harmony down below. But it all is miraculously lightened in this performance. I mean, you hear the individual timbres of the instrumental choirs. The tune is clearly in the woodwind group, which is plainly audible. And what makes it so marvelous for me is that I have never heard it sound so much like Dvorak. You hear like the entire concept of orchestral sound and melody, with major turning to minor and whatnot harmonically, that Dvorak appropriated for his own music. It's in this trio. And I've never been so conscious of that as in this performance. So it was just a wonderful experience getting to know this recording, which has been out forever, and which no one ever paid attention to, and which made Maestro Slatkin's 10 best list. I mean, his 10 best list, I must say, it's not just, you know, the objective best, which of course that's my list, completely objective. His is based on a combination of quality of results and his own personal fondness for the recording, you know, which adds a subjective element. And of course, you know, I have banished subjectivity from all of my musical judgments. But this is really good. He was right. And because he stuck it on that list, I went back and listened to it all over again, several times, in fact. And I was just thrilled by how wonderfully the whole performance flowed, how effortless it was in a symphony that usually is a slog. You know, I mean, he really, really brought home the bacon, and my hat's off to him. In repertoire, which he is not generally known for, and I will say there are a few other things on his list that may surprise you, and maybe a few things on my list that will surprise you. And so I hope that you will join us on classicstoday.com in the insider section and subscribe. If you're not an insider, you'll get to hear sound clips, including some of this. And it really is going to be, I think, a very, very interesting and enjoyable experience for all of us. And I want to thank Maestro Slatkin very, very sincerely for contributing and for being a part of this. And I hope you will all thank him as well. because he deserves it. And it's just such a rare thing to have one of these artists actually acknowledge the public in such a friendly and informal and not control freaky kind of way. I'm just delighted, and I hope you will be too. So thank you so much for joining me, friends. Keep on listening. I'll see you over at classicstoday.com. Take care.